Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
Dante.
An inmate at the Jackson Correctional Institution. All calls, other than properly placed attorney calls, may be monitored and recorded. To accept charges, press 1. To refuse charges, press 2.
If you would like to permanently block your number from receiving calls from this facility, press
6.
for balance and rate quotes, press
7. Thank you for using
CenturyLink.
You may start the conversation now.
Welcome to the Incarcerate U.S. podcast. I'm your host, Dante Cottingham. And this morning, I'm speaking to Miss Shenandoah Chefalo. She's a volunteer for several local, national, and international organizations, a member of the National Speakers Association, a certified life coach, and the author of a book entitled Garbage Bag Suitcase, a memoir that chronicles her journey to overcome a desolate childhood, including a broken foster care system. Good morning, Ms. Chefalo.
Thanks for having me on, Dante.
I'd like to thank you for, you're welcome. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to have this discussion. I have some questions I'd like to ask you to get your perspective on some of the components of mass incarceration in America. But before we get to those, let's talk a little bit about your memoir. What inspired you to share your journey with us? And please give us an overview.
Yeah, so I went into foster care at the age of 13, and I aged out of the foster care at the age of 18. But I decided that when I turned 18, I would never tell anybody that I had spent time in foster care. So I spent the next 20 years of my life from aging out never disclosing that to anyone, including my husband, whom I had been married to over 18 years when I finally told him. And what happened is I ended up in an interesting career. I was running law offices in Michigan, and I primarily was working with criminal defendants. And my husband was a criminal law attorney, and we would come home every night and say, you know, how do we help our clients make better decisions? We were watching clients and sometimes clients' family members sort of revolving through the criminal justice door. And I went back to school, got my life coaching certificate in a hope that that would be a way for me to help clients. And when I started coaching clients, they really started sharing more about their life prior to their criminal act of whatever that was. And I was really surprised to learn how many clients, especially in a rural area that I was living at the time, had spent time in the foster care system. And so one day at lunch, I just Googled foster care statistics and found out that of the 1.6 million people roughly incarcerated in this country, 1.2 million had spent time in foster care. And that, of course, as someone who had spent time in foster care, really struck a nerve with me. And I came home from work the next day and told my husband I was going to write a book. And he said, that's funny. What have you done to write a book about? And I said, well, sit down. I have a story to tell. And so I wrote Garbage Bag Suitcase, not to just share about my journey in care, but really for me about what I saw as a system feeding a bunch of other systems and what we could do as a society to start addressing the real issue, which in my mind is sort of trauma and early childhood trauma and the neurobiology of the brain. And so for me, this book was about getting that message out about how do we address trauma and how is it affecting people and why do we have a mass incarceration that we do in the U.S.
Okay. And it sounds like there's a link between foster care and incarceration. It sounds like there's a pretty strong link between the two.
Well, absolutely. There's also a strong link between foster care and substance abuse, which is sometimes the intermediary before incarceration, right? So,
right.
And there's a strong link between foster care and homelessness, which also is an intramarily thing before people get incarcerated. So it's interesting because what we know is that no child enters foster care because things are great at home, right? So something has happened. Some sort of trauma has occurred. And I really believe that those early childhood traumas, whether they lead you to foster care or whether they are traumas that just happen within your regular functional home, so to speak, affect us. And we know that they affect us on a cellular level, and they change the way in which the brain functions. And then what you have are a bunch of people functioning in what I call trauma brain, which is this fight, flight, freeze, appease mode. And when you're in that mode, you're not making good decisions. You know, I liken it to if you're walking out on a trail and a bear jumps out at you, you know, what type of person are you? Are you the fighter, the flighter, the freezer, or the lay down and let me eat you appeaser, right?
Absolutely, right.
There's 4 types. And if that's what you're triggered to do all the time and you're constantly in fight mode or you're constantly in flight or appease mode, you're going to make decisions that are going to lead you to incarceration. Now,
unfortunately, the response to that, because I agree with you 100%. You just described like some of my own personal experiences, but unfortunately, the American response to that is to criminalize it and then incarcerate. Unfortunately.
Well, exactly, because we don't understand that somebody's in trauma brain. Now, when I say that, and especially when we talk about incarceration, it's hard because people say, right, law enforcement says it all the time. So a kid steals a car, then we should just say, well, you've had childhood trauma and not hold you accountable. No, holding someone accountable is different than understanding trauma brain. And you can still hold someone accountable while addressing the issues of their trauma brain. Because what we're doing in America is we're so focused on the punishment piece of it that we don't care what your trauma is, and we're not going to address any of those issues to help you rehabilitate and become a better person. We're just going to punish you, which oftentimes is causing more trauma and more things that you're ultimately going to need to heal from, which is why we see, right, the recidivism of prisoners who get out of prison and then they just end up cycling right back in. We see that because at the core, we're not addressing the fundamental trauma that's caused them to be incarcerated in the first place.
And what's the saying? I'm sure you heard it, hurt people. And so that cycle just continues and continues and continues. So quickly, how does the foster care system work? And in your perspective, what makes it broken?
Well, just about every way in which it's functioning is broken. And in my mind, it needs to be completely reinvented. We need to throw out everything we know and start over from scratch because currently nothing is working in that system. Yes, you can find case stories of people like myself who somehow managed to avoid incarceration, but I don't think we should be using luck as our way to which we build a system when we know that boys who age out of the system, over half of them will have a felony conviction before they turn 19 and a half. So that's what we have to address, and we have to address that by changing fundamentally the language and the communication in which we're even tackling these issues. When you're dealing with someone in trauma brain, the way in which you need to communicate with them is different. And I make an argument that there are no adult people walking around on this planet who have not faced some sort of trauma or adversity in their lifetime. And thus, we need to invent a whole new language in which we're speaking to people so we can fundamentally empower people to heal themselves and to rise up and build resilience and become the people that they were meant to be.
No doubt. And I agree with you 1,000%. But to our listeners who may have a perspective that says like something like this, if they do the crime, they need to do the time. What do you say to that?
Okay, well, there's instances, and I've represented and been involved in cases where there's people in my mind who absolutely needed to do some time in prison. No doubt about it, Dante, and I'm sure you know these people as well, right?
Yes, I do,
I have
absolutely.
no question. But while they're doing their time, why can't we address what caused them to get an addiction, what caused them to do their crime in the first place? How do we address that? Because most of these individuals are coming out of prison. At some point, most people are going to get paroled. You know, there's a small percentage of people who are never coming home.
Right.
What are we going to do to make them come out of prison and become a whole person?
Absolutely.
Right?
It's actually like 90% of people are coming home at some point. It's a huge percent of that millions of people that's incarcerated.
So we have to help them address their underlying trauma and adversity so that they get off of that trauma brain. Because what we know is that the brain is plastic, and we can change it at any time. It's easier when we're a child. It's harder when we're adult, but it can change at any time. And when we get people addressing that, and what I found with most inmates specifically is they don't even understand that those things in their childhood are having an effect on those decisions they made as an adult. And when you start to explain that and they start to understand the actual science behind it, that those times when they thought, oh, I'm just crazy or I just don't know or I can't control that, there's science behind that helps them. And when people start to understand that and they see it and they can start then addressing it and talking about it, especially men. I can't tell you how many male inmates that I've dealt with who've been sexually abused, who had significant traumas in childhood, who've never talked about it.
Absolutely. And I can attest.
That affects their decisions.
I can attest to what you're saying. You may know my story. I've been locked up since I was 17. But one of the reasons why I came to prison so young, because I was extremely angry, and at the time I didn't know what I was angry about. It took me many years for me to look back and get an understanding about what it is. I understand it now, but as a teenager, as a kid, you feel the emotion, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways, but you just don't know where it's coming from. So I agree with you 1,000%.
Oh, yes, and that's at the core of then why are we also locking up juveniles, right, Dante? Which is,
absolutely,
if we're not really going to address that, in my mind, part of the reason the foster care system is so broken is that, you know, as a society, we are taking a child from a home and saying, we can protect you and do something better than what your biological parents can do. And then the bottom line is, we physically remove them from a situation only to put them in more trauma and give them more trauma, no supports, no help, no skills to make them better, to heal from their anger, to heal from their trauma brain. And then, it's no surprise that they wind up in prison. Why does it surprise anyone when we don't want to address it and we don't want to stand up and take our responsibility as a community?
You're absolutely right, and they don't. They don't take that into consideration. I was a teenager, and I got waived to the adult court system, and they put me right in with the adults, right in the place where they wasn't paying attention to my development. You in there now. You have to find a way to survive, and that's their approach, unfortunately. It's my understanding that you became one of the 3% of foster care kids who got into college, and one of the 1% who graduated. First of all, congratulations for overcoming those odds.
Thank you.
But you're welcome. But what characteristics of the foster care system do you believe contributes to a low college attendance and graduation? Why do you think it's so low?
It's really simple. You know, I turned 18 halfway through my senior year of college, and when you turn 18 in the foster care system at midnight, it's goodbye, right? That's it. You're on your own. I don't know too many 18-year-olds who would stand up. I don't know too many adults who would say at 18 they were ready to completely be on their own with no support emotionally, mentally, financially, nothing. They can just handle it on their own. And when you're thrown into that situation, you've got to make life or death decisions. How are you going to pay for housing? How are you going to pay for food? And frankly, that's why we see, you know, half of the boys who age out have a felony conviction, and primarily 90% of those convictions are drug related because they're trying to pay their rent. I mean, this isn't rocket science that we're talking about. And half of the girls are pregnant by the time they're 19 and a half. Also not rocket scientists. You get twice as much welfare if you have a kid with you, and you qualify for more resources. I mean, it's a really simple problem, but nobody wants to get to the core and address it. So it's really hard for foster kids to be focused on college. I got into college because I had a teacher who really believed in me. That's one reason. I'm white. That's another reason. And I had some opportunities other people didn't have. But I'll tell you, I was in college and almost dropped out of my first semester because I couldn't pay for my basic things. And it became a really tough decision. I luckily ended up at a job working at a law office surrounded by some great mentors who are able to steer me into the right direction. But that's luck, and we've got to stop relying on luck to help kids become the people they need to be. We need resources, and we need to have a different conversation around trauma and adversity and help people understand their own lens that they're bringing to this conversation.
I agree with you 100%. I want to make sure I get in. Unfortunately, our call, I have a feeling we can have a conversation for hours, to be honest with you.
That's right.
I want to very quickly make sure I get in. To our listeners who may be interested in buying a copy of your memoir, where is it available for purchase?
You can get it on Amazon.com. You can get it from my website. You can contact me directly. Any of those ways you can find the book, GarbageBagSuitcase.com.
Okay, and I'm going to make sure to put some links along with this podcast as well.
That sounds great.
So since I've been in prison, I did about 3 years in the hole. I was messing up in the beginning. I was getting into a lot of trouble. So I ended up doing a lot of time in solitary confinement. But for whatever reason, it didn't break me.
Right.
I've seen it destroy so many people. But my question to you is, why do you think it didn't destroy you? Going through the foster care system, it's broken, and all of your experiences. How do you answer that? Because I can't answer. I don't know why solitary confinement didn't destroy me. I don't know why my experiences didn't. Why don't you think it didn't destroy you? Because I'm sure it destroyed a lot of other people.
Absolutely, and you know it does. The bottom line is, Dante, is resilience, right? And I think we both have resilience in different ways. But that's the thing, is that we can talk all this negative stuff about trauma and adversity, but there's a reverse side to that, and that's resilience. And we can build resilience in people, and some people have different resilience mechanisms than others.
Properly placed attorney calls may be monitored and recorded.
Absolutely. And real quickly, when it comes to mass incarceration, how do you think America's gotten itself into this crisis?
Well, I liken it all the way back to the Pilgrims, Dante, in that the Pilgrims really believed in punishment, right? And that in retribution. And we're so focused on that idea of punishment and accountability, which is absolutely a piece. Sometimes people commit crimes that they need to be held accountable for. But we can hold people accountable in a way in which we're not punishing them for the rest of their lives, right? So there's a saying that says that justice is being punished once and injustice is being punished forever. And we're punishing people forever. Because even if you're an inmate and you go in and do your time, coming out is hard because who's going to hire you? How are you getting a job? And what job is that? And then that leads you right back into the original life to start with. And so we have to come to a point where if someone has paid their debt to society, we have to be done with it. We can't continue holding this over people's heads forever and ever.
So what do you, I agree with you 100%. What do you think the solution is? What's the first step towards that solution, of reaching that place that you just described?
Well, the first step for me is I'd love to start being able to train wardens and corrections officers about trauma and how they bring their own trauma into the workplace and how that trauma is affecting not only them but the inmates there. I think that then opens us up to having conversations with inmates directly about decisions and choices. Because when you start getting a community to understand what's going on and you get inmates and correctional officers to understand how trauma is affecting them on a day-to-day basis, both their own and the people that they work with, you can have a whole new conversation, and that's how we start having this. Of course, that's getting Americans to open their eyes and realize also that juvenile delinquents might not need to be held accountable in the same way as adults.
And any sensible person in prison, rational person in prison, would acknowledge that imprisonment is definitely necessary for a just society. No question about it. But it's extreme forms of incarceration that's the problem. And so I agree with you. We can do it in a way where justice is being served, but not destruction. And they have unfortunately, a lot of our policies destroy a lot of peace. I see it every day. So I agree with you 100%. This is a really, really good discussion. And I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me this morning.
I'm so glad to have been on, Dante. I'd love to come on anytime and talk with you more.
I'm gonna definitely take you up on that. You have a beautiful day. Thank you again.
You too. Thanks, Dante.
This is Dante signing off with the Incarcerate US podcast, the place where all of our voices come together.
The caller has hung up.